welcome all of you here to KPMG's Ignition Center. We love to be able to expose all of our members to spaces like this where really cutting edge work is being done. We'd also like to thank our Innovation Forum sponsors, the Energy BBDO and KPMG. So thank you very much for supporting all of our programming and providing such amazing content for us tonight. We will be learning tonight about the difference between buzz in the business community and actual signs of disruption. And our speakers from KPMG are going to be teaching us how to navigate these signals of change, and we hope you find a lot of great value in their presentation. You'll find more information about both Brian and Kez in the bio sheets that are found at your seats, as well as some more information about KPMG and some wonderful swag for you. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Brian and Kez.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Brian Miskey. I lead the Innovation Lab here at our Ignition Center. One of the key things that we did here in this wonderful space is really kind of deconstruct the environment to help people feel more comfortable and ready to explore. So we help shift a lot of the mindset of the way people experience innovation and study disruption. So we kind of take that in, working with our clients, working with our partners and our professionals here. It's really been a blessing for all of us. And in terms of what we're able to do on a consistent and a daily basis is connect with each other from different groups. And I know that's a rarity, especially from a time perspective. But that's something that we do consistently. We work with folks within Chicago as well as from all over the world who come in here. So with that, my associate Kez Panthar will introduce himself, and he's going to take us through kind of a journey with understanding where signals are coming from and how we should pay attention to them. So Kez.
All right. Thank you, Brian. So Kez Panthar, I'm head of research at KPMG's Innovation Labs. I'm actually based out in New York, but with the launch of the Chicago Center, I've been spending more time out here, and this is a great opportunity to get in front of you. So, the presentation on paying attention to the right signals is really a presentation we give to clients who are trying to work out, how disruption's affecting them. What do you pay attention to with all this information coming at us? And we've got a framework and a way of thinking about things which will help. And after this presentation, we're going to be doing a number of exercises in the Innovation Lab. So hopefully many of you can join us for that as well. So what does it mean by paying attention to the right signals? With so much data which we have available to us, if you as an industry or a client trying to work in this space, you have to try and make sense of what's happening. There's so much happening with technology, regulation, social change, and obviously markets and economics. So this is kind of the step framework which we talk through. But I'm going to step back a little bit, because my background is sort of innovation and doing a lot of work with behavior and anthropology. So this is a great quote from Grant McCracken, who's an anthropologist. And here's this quote like, monitoring American culture as if listening to the shipping lanes on shortwave radio. There's this fascinating bit where he talks about, as the start of his book, he talks about this concept of Greensboro, Alabama, basically sharing pie to get the community engaged. And he was like, pie? Really? Why pie? That sounds interesting. As an anthropologist, this is what you pay attention to. What are these interesting signals? This is different. The reality was, this was a number of years ago, they started realizing that their communities were fragmented. This was a long time before, where the concept of Brexit or 2016, the idea that communities weren't communicating together. Bowling alone, Philip Putnam talked about that, and they realized that by bringing pie, they could get people together to actually have conversations, people from different parts of their community. But paying attention to these really interesting signals is something an anthropologist does really well. So we're bringing that to more the business sense of things. As we look at this idea of paying attention to shortwave radio is this great metaphor which we realized we could use to think through how we think about how disruption happens. So this concept of short waves and long waves. Short waves is very much around the data and the aspects which we pay attention to, especially as businesses, especially in this day and age where we are inundated with an amount of data. We've got data scientists and we've got deep learning algorithms which help us think through it. But the long wave signals is where we find the things which surprise us, the things which catch us off guard. And I'm going to walk you through both of these. So the idea of shortwave signals. So my background is actually, I started 25 plus years ago doing AI research in what is now today deep learning. But we called it neural networks and genetic algorithms back then. The idea that today we would have algorithms which could drive cars was something which was completely out there. My professor was doing research on self-driving vans, and it took a van full of computers, and it could not make it from here to there without some form of accident. The idea that today we would have algorithms which could allow cars to drive around freely was something which we thought would take at least 30, 40, 50 years. So my background as data scientist and deep learning and AI leads me to sort of this world where, gosh, so much data. How do we pay attention to the right things? It's very easy to look at the data that you have and draw up models about the future. But the challenge is, what those models tell you is best sort of defined in this framework which we came up with. So this is what we call the known, unknown framework. So Donald Rumsfeld got into a lot of trouble many years ago trying to explain this verbally. A visual helps a little bit, but this idea that as you think about the future, this frame of reference is a good way to think about it. So the known is all the things which we have information about. It's today. It's the stuff which we have. The known unknown is best sort of looking at how we model things out. So I don't care how sophisticated your deep learning algorithm is or your data scientist models are, at some level they're doing this. They're taking information about today, modeling it out to the future, and they're making an assumption that the future looks like the past. That's basically the essence of what a lot of data science is trying to do, finding patterns to be able to see how things play out. You remember scenario planning back from the 90s, they used to do things like look at alternate futures. How does this play out? Alternate futures is very much this idea that, as things happen, there could be binary events. Somebody's going to win the 2020 election. We know somebody's going to win that. We don't know who it is, but it's kind of considering like a binary event, Democrats or Republicans. Binary events aren't the end of the situation either, because a lot of events happen along what we call a range. Anything could happen along this range. Technology could play out in a particular way. These models can give you a variance of quite wide. But the world of looking at the future, assuming that it looks like the past, only takes you so far. And this is what we find, and we spend a lot of time, Brian, myself, the Innovation Lab at KPMG, looking and helping clients through the world in which we're living in today, the disruption which is happening at business models. Uber and what they did with taxi companies. How they came about, how they changed the nature of that whole industry. And this was the industry which people thought was highly regulated, had very powerful players with deep pockets running this. The idea that a company could come in and disrupt it was unheard of. To the point in my past life, we acquired Travis's first company, Red Swoosh. And when he talked about going off and starting this company, he said, I'm not even touching the taxi companies. I'm just going after the slack in the black car industry. I can make a really nice fortune just doing that alone. But the idea that he was going to have to do with the taxi industry was something which actually he got very excited about when it happened. Looking at the sort of shortwave signals, you miss those long waves, the things which happen and which have huge disruption effects. And this is where, how do you get a sense of these long waves happening? So I talked about step before, social changes, technology changes, technology going exponential, economics and markets. How many of you in this room are familiar with the concept of platform business models? You've got the Amazons, the Facebooks, even Microsofts back in the day. It was interesting, when we started the lab in 2014, we studied industry after industry, and we realized that it doesn't matter what it was. It was like power and utilities. One of these FANG companies was right up there. And actually it was one of them out of all the four, which was generally in virtually every industry we touched. We went into senior living, and Amazon was there. Amazon was trying to work out what to do in this space, because they were trying to understand this aging and what was happening to the aging population. These technology companies which everybody talked of as technology companies, were actually running a very different kind of business model. This business model, which we unpacked, was actually the platform business model. How that plays out is very different than traditional competitive sort of strategy. Competitive advantage looks very different. Porter Spice Forces doesn't work when you're playing with a company which has two-sided network effects. So that was one of the things which we started realizing was, from an economics and markets, how businesses compete was changing. And obviously regulation. We're at KPMG, we pay a lot of attention to regulation, but understanding how regulation can change markets is the other area which we realize does a lot of disruption. And that is the political part of this.
Yeah, Cass, I think in turn, there's two examples, and we've talked about this a lot. When you look at multiple industries, you look at from Uber, from Airbnb, and what classifies as a hotel versus a home residence, right? How it should be taxed, cannabis, right? That whole spectrum. Regulation is just trying to keep up with all this disruption, and that's what we're seeing. And that's kind of making certain markets unstable, in certain ways. There's a lot of ways that we think about things, short wave as well as long wave, and looking at, we didn't say this or we didn't quote this, but it was more about the fringe often predicts the future. We're trying to look at all these different elements. And one other example is that when you start to look at, when we looked at financial services, which was one of our baseline, was that every single not FANG company, but big tech company applied for a banking charter. Not a lot of people know that. But if you look at the platform business model, there's a logic behind everything that they're doing, and they're peeling the onion back on almost every single aspect of the way in which we live today.
Yeah, regulation is definitely fascinating because it always lags behind, and a lot of these companies go all the way right up to the line of regulation. So these long wave signals, the best way is this quote. It's Ernest Hemingway, and he basically says, now how do you go bankrupt? Two ways, gradually and suddenly. Because long wave signals is one of those things, it's not like they come out of the blue. They come at us slowly. They come at us at a speed where we just stop paying attention to them. We used to, coming from sort of a digital strategy perspective, we were talking about millennials back in 2002. We talked about them forever, but until they hit the marketplace, until they came in and started becoming employees and consumers at scale, the disruption didn't happen. People had stopped paying attention to them. When you talk about technologies is even harder, because sometimes these technologies take a huge amount of time to actually come to fruition. And I'll give you a couple of examples which I personally struggled with. But how you model this out is what we call the future possible. So coming back to this framework, this idea of you pay attention more to what we call the unknown knowns. The future is already here, but just not evenly distributed. There's a great quote to think about. There's things happening which you're not paying attention to, or you've stopped paying attention to, which can have a much larger impact than you actually realize. This idea of being able to look through that angle as opposed to just assuming the future looks like the past. So 100 years ago, the factories were basically run around a central shaft because steam power came in and it was through a centralized mechanism and it ran a shaft which ran all the factories. Electricity came along, and what these companies did was basically replace electricity with steam. It took another 40 years for somebody to realize that you didn't have to have everything run a central shaft, before somebody actually realized you could distribute power to wherever, to the point the rise of things like the assembly line came about because you realized you could actually distribute power. This research which Eric Brynjolfsson out of MIT did was the realization that this happens over and over again. When new technology comes along, companies take it and basically put it against their existing business model. They use it the way the old technology used to do. Mainframes were replaced by microcomputers, replaced by client server PCs, whatever it is. It takes a while before somebody realizes that I can do different things with this. I can compete differently. I can drive different strategies. So another example. This is a personal example. So this is virtual reality. The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. It was said by William Gibson. William Gibson, after spending a whole day in VR demos, staggered out and he talked to his friend Kevin Kelly. Kevin Kelly wrote about this, and he basically said these famous words, which have been repeated many, many times. He's never actually written them. But he said this, staggering out of this, a day spent in VR demos. What year do you think that was? Anybody got a guess?
2002.
Okay. Anybody else?
72.
It's getting closer.
Yeah, I was gonna say like probably 1963
I was going to say 65.
Well, some of the start of VR technologies did happen much earlier.
Yeah.
But William Gibson said it in 1989. 1989 was when I was trying to pick what I was going to do research at university. And I was so convinced that VR was going to be here, I was like, I'm not going to study VR, I'm going to go and study AI. I didn't believe that 30 years later, I'd still be waiting for VR at consumer scale. The reality is, it's taken this long and we still don't have it. Palmer-Luckey, with some of the stuff he did with Oculus, is changing the trajectory and bringing some of that future a little closer, but we still don't have it. The reality is these technologies take longer sometimes. Why they take longer and what you pay attention to is something which we've been digging into. Let me give you a couple more examples. So this is a more famous one. It's a Netflix and Reed Hastings. So when Reed Hastings started Netflix in the late 90s, he basically knew that it wasn't going to end with just DVDs. He knew then that wasn't his end game, because he realized with the internet coming along that eventually the speeds were going to be there that you were going to be able to stream. This seems obvious today, but you have to remember back. I was in the dot-com boom, I was an internet consultant, I started companies. This is the era when the Victoria's Secret's fashion show crashed the internet. And people basically said in the media industry, I was in New York City, people in the media industry said, oh, this internet thing, forget about it. You're never going to be able to stream anything of value. Like, we've got whole companies which deal with the networks. Forget about this internet thing. But we knew that the technology was going to get there. We knew that eventually the speeds were going to get faster, the bandwidths were going to be there, the adoption, which is the most important bit, was going to take on. Designing a business to play into that where the hockey puck was going to go was what Reed Hastings did. Being able to anticipate where the future is going allows you to be ahead of the curve. Like Blockbuster, even to the last moment before they went down, they were like, all right, we get it, digital. All right, we're going to move everything streaming. They actually approached us as a digital agency back in like 2009 going, help us move to the digital. And that was their 10th attempt at it. But they didn't take it seriously.
2008, I worked for Viacom. So Blockbuster was part of our assets we acquired. 2008, the CEO of Blockbuster basically said that Netflix and Redbox is not even, an afterthought. 2009, they're engaging Kessler's company. 2010, they filed for bankruptcy. So gradually and suddenly, right? So you start to think about these things, and as senior executives, the biggest challenge is not necessarily understanding signals, which is a big issue. It's understanding how creativity is actually embodied within your organization, or at least the senior people in your organization. Because that's where you start to look at a diversity of thought and ideas, right? That's some of the big things that are playing into everything that Kes is talking about today. And it affects your organizations, your clients, your customers, what have you.
I mean, my challenge, as opposed to what executives go through these discussions like Blockbuster, is I assume the future is going to happen much faster. I live on the edge. I start living in the future. As some people say, that you start believing this technology is already here. It takes much longer than you anticipate. That's been my mistake. I was in deep learning before the AI winter, a long time before this actually became a reality. So getting ahead, getting it right, being ahead of the curve is sometimes hard, but knowing how long things can take and what are the implications and knowing the signals to pay attention to when things trigger is important. Let me give you a slightly older one, which actually talks a little bit about another dimension. So Pan Am, 100 years ago, one of the top innovators in technology for flying. You know, we take flying for granted today. But the reality of getting a metal tube and flying across the country or across the world is something which back then was something which most people feared. The same way people say today, I'll never get in a self-driving car, was the same kind of reaction you got from the everyday people. So they did everything from having people fly the Atlantic Ocean, and they made it more dynamic, and they made it into this really, like vision of what rich people did to sell the dream. This Pan Am became one of the largest companies to the point in 1968, with the launch of 2001 Space Odyssey, which had Pan Am logo and the space ride, they actually started taking reservations for a space trip. That's how confident they were that they were going to be around for another 30 years, is the estimate of when they were going to have commercial spaceflight. But something happened a decade after that. Until 1978. 78, they were one of the most dominant companies in US sort of economics. What happened was regulation change. And actually the regulation change, the deregulation, was something they looked at the time, and they thought it was going to be opportunity because they could now charge anything they wanted. They thought this was going to be a boon for their business, one of the most strong, profitable businesses at the time. The reality was, they were one of those companies which didn't make it. They got demolished because what happened was the business model innovators came along and started cutting the costs, finding operational excellence, doing the stuff which innovators find boring, but it's the stuff which makes money. They started innovating with things like loyalty programs, American Airlines. They started changing and competing in a very different way. Pan Am didn't make it because they missed this idea of what regulation was actually going to play out. So how regulation plays out is very different than what you think. You think it's going to lead to larger margins for you, but the reality is how it plays out can play out in many different dimensions. So understanding those implications and those signals and what it could be is actually a creative act. Because as Brian said, what you do with those signals is creativity. It is innovation. The boring stuff of operational excellence and business model change is the stuff which actually drives competitive advantage. So how we think about it, how you think about these signals, whether it's technology change or regulation change, they also don't happen in isolation. They play together. And how they play out is a framework which we've been working called value chain reshuffling. Because what happens when a technology or a regulation shifts the dynamic in the supply chain, this value chain, it changes competition. Because when something happens in distribution, that gets cheaper, suddenly the competition and value is driven elsewhere. Because when you can own one dimension of a value chain, that's when you make money. And that's what businesses do really well. But when it changes, everything's up in the air because now the value is going to shift to somewhere else. So being able to map this out, map long wave signals, how it affects supply chains or value chains, and then be able to see how the competition could change, the creativity and innovation involved to know what to do with it, is where we spend a lot of our time. This is what we spend a lot of conversations with our clients about. So bringing this together, you can't forget about shortwave signals. You have to bring it together with long wave signals, because putting those two pictures together gives you a better sense of where the world's going, better sense of what that unknown is. So that is the real power, and that's what we spend a lot of time, and that's what we want to go through a quick exercise with you after this. But I want to stop here quickly for questions, and before we move on to doing a quick exercise around this.
It seems like there's a lot of value to the second mover in some of these innovations. At least, you mentioned the first mover, the first great idea, way back in 1989, and then that's a great term, that value chain reshuffling. The second mover does that.
Well, the interesting piece is, the reason it normally goes to the second mover is the first mover is normally more that technology innovator. So there's a great book called Loonshots, which actually walks through some of these. It's the technology innovator works in a very particular way. They believe certain things. So they believe a little bit too much in the technology they've developed, Like Pan Am was very focused on the next greatest airplane, the engine. They moved to the jet engine first. They were constantly innovating, but they didn't think about the business model. So sometimes that does happen. But what you find as well is there's companies out there like Amazon, which isn't just about technology. They also think about business models. Like you've got Alibaba in China, which was a very much they got to the platform business model before Amazon did. They started off with a platform business model. Amazon started off with an e-commerce company. They didn't go to a platform business model until like 2003. Alibaba started in the late 90s and started it straight into the platform business model. So some people get it right out of the gate, and it's very hard to catch up if somebody has it. But innovators in general are technology driven, and I think the idea is they get a little too enamored with the technology only, and it becomes sort of a hammer. I've got a hammer, so I'm going to solve every problem with that.
I mean, that's a great point. I think in terms of the value chain reshuffling, it's also understanding what is actually changing, what are the interdependencies that are changing across how work is done, right? So we talk about a lot about automation today, talk a lot about upskilling through different types of generations, recognizing that Gen Z is entering the workforce as of this month. There's a lot of things that are happening. What is being offshore? What is being onshore? You have to balance all these different, not you, I mean, we collectively have to balance all of this with not just our people, but from a business process, from things that Kes talked about with kind of being way too enamored with technology. That's where we get fooled, and it's more of the kind of the balance. And that's why I keep on bringing up the concept of creativity, is being able to connect all these different things together. That's I think that's kind of the broader secret sauce to everything that we collectively do. It's intellectual curiosity, creativity, and practicality put together.
We've got a framework called adjacent possibility.
Yes.
Adjacent possible, which takes on things like technologies or regulation and basically maps out the possibility space. Do what great entrepreneurs do, but actually map it all out so you can actually see what the potentials are, the possibilities.
Yeah, you mentioned this is the second time you mentioned creativity, which I think is really important, so thank you. I'm wondering if you have any kind of diagnostic or way of assessing the level of creativity in the places where it needs to be in a company. So that's just brute force.
I think, well,
so we've got a number of different frameworks. So it's funny you should say that. The ISO committee, I was in a global meeting last week, and the ISO committee is just releasing, it's going to be in the next few weeks, a standard for innovation for companies. In the US, we've got a company called AM Best, which is basically insurance companies. They've got an assessment for insurance companies, and they're going to base their credit rating based upon that. So there's things you could look at, and we spend a lot of time. We've helped companies build up, where should they, drive innovation? How do they drive it across their organization? We're a 120-year-old accounting company. Trying to innovate, like standing in front of the board, trying to explain design thinking to them 5 years ago, as somebody who's acquired it from a digital agency, was, trying to explain, it's called move fast and break things, or fail fast, to a bunch of accountants and auditors. It doesn't go over great. But trying to put it in their language was something which I basically explained it. It's like, it's about learning fast. You have to learn about the things that you don't know, and that was the investment they started making. This turned into a place like this. So there are ways you can start thinking about diagnostic to work out where do you have the creativity, how does creativity actually flow across the organization? Because if it's siloed, like when we look at organizations, whether it's Apple or Samsung, as an example, it's like to understand, does that creativity make it out of the technology era? Is the chief design officer, do they have a seat at the C-level? Because that starts telling you a little bit about how much they're taking it seriously. Because otherwise you're just a bunch of creatives in a room and a bunch of designers. They don't have as much influence as you think they do. So there are a lot to unpack in trying to work out a diagnostic for it.
Yes, ma'am.
So as you're sharing what you're sharing right now, and when you were sharing the Blockbuster story, can you speak a little bit about risk aversion or risk perception, especially?
Yeah, so we have kind of an overall philosophy, correct me on this. When you talk about risk aversion, when I was at Blockbusters per se, but Viacom and kind of looking at what was going on, there's a lot of challenges with I'm not going to say arrogance, but it's kind of intellectual arrogance, based that their business model had X amount of stores and they were highly profitable, and it was kind of a Friday night, different types of thing. They had the movie awards, and all, they were kind of getting out of their zone because things were developing so quickly. So when you talk about risk aversion, it wasn't about let's go experiment doing the same things. Let's make what we do better so we can make a higher profit. That's antiquated thinking.
And that goes back to the gross margin.
Yeah.
Isn't
with
the
panic.
driver
No, so but
necessarily.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So the concept of enterprise risk management
Right.
is really about connecting risk. So it's finding what is the optimal level of risk that I can take in order to kind of balance where I'm investing dollars, sequencing investments, as well as investing in people and skills and what have you.
I mean, the thing I'll add to that is we spend a lot of time, and we work with audit committees to help them think through doing nothing is a risky proposition in itself.
It's a decision. I mean,
It's a decision. Doing nothing is a decision, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we try to explain. We've got sort of exercises to help them think through what does that actually mean,
Yeah.
and really starting to think through, this is really about learning,
Yeah.
because the problem with doing some of these things is the fact that it's an unknown. And we're not very good as humans with dealing with the unknowns. And having a set method we can go through to help them, and it's all about learning as you do more, is something which is much easier to get your head around. An experiment has to have like something you learn coming out of it. So that helps with that risk aversion sort of mindset. Yes.
Kes, love your presentation and your perspectives. How do you see power laws playing into this? I mean, observation that's kind of that's been a long signal, or power law by definition is a long signal. But you've seen the emergence of more and more of that occurring across industries.
So power law, especially at the scale of the things which are happening. So there was a research we did on future retail very recently, and we started looking at how ideas spread and how ideas spread very differently. So the old model of adoption curve came out of, farming innovation research, Everett Rogers, sorry. So that speed of how things tip, which is driven by things like power laws, is something which we pay attention as early drivers of signals. Like when you're trying to see what are the pre-signals of something about to happen, like you think this is going to tip, what are the precursors to it? If you understand that this can be driven by a power law, you can actually use it. So power law is just a different kind of statistical model, if you think about it that way. And it's like, it's going to work in this way, your assumption is, so you can start paying attention to where that's going to go.
I think there's also bigger, kind of widening the aperture a little bit. We challenge conventional approaches, so even kind of looking at that, we put the what ifs, into play. And I know everyone's done that, but we put it on. It's on steroids because then we kind of challenge each other, and we kind of work things out, and it's kind of like an intellectual cage match. But being able to kind of look at something that we're actually going to go into, and that's why I'm trying to segue to move us in there, is to kind of look at these three different futures, which is a nice way of, it's kind of Kes's framework to a certain degree, but it helps ground people in this type of thinking. Because a lot of this gets into, you really have to study it, you really have to kind of deconstruct it somewhat. What you're going to be able to go through right now is it being applied in a very specific way by all of your experiences. Okay? So let's get up. You can bring the beers and the wine, and we're going to follow straight down this hall. Liz?